Hey, welcome back to Unschooled Theology. I am your host, Eric, and today we are going to look at Genesis 4, verses 6 and 7, so let's read those now. The Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry, and why has your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it." All right, so this verse might not seem these couple of verses might not seem like a whole lot. In some ways, it just seems like, well, this is just a clarifying of the rejection, right? But I think actually some of the ideas here are some of the most important in regards to this story. This is where the whole story sort of hinges. The question is not, what happened before here and why did Cain give the wrong sacrifice and whatnot. That's what Cain does. He's earthy. And we're all a little bit like Cain because we're all a bit earthy. We're not all like Abel. And truth be told, the more Abel we become, sometimes the world rises up and kills you, hence the story of Christian martyrdom. But that's okay, thankfully. That is the blessing of the second coming. So moving on, this moment here where God explains to Cain the source of his rejection, and as well as the cliff that Cain teeters on a little bit, that this is where the story hinges. And so there's a lot that happens here, even though it might maybe not seem like it at first. So the first thing we see here is God's questioning of Cain's anger and fallen countenance. And this is a rhetorical question, right? Because he does not give Cain a chance to answer. So that's interesting. And I think this is important because he's not giving Cain a chance to shift blame to God, right? Because the blame belongs to Cain. So God doesn't even give him a chance to say, well, it's your fault for not taking it. No, the blame is squarely on Cain. Now, the reason I say this is that some argue that the first phrase of verse 7 here is very closely tied to verse 6, right? The fallen face. The idea being that Cain's face would be held high if he sacrificed rightly, right? And so when we put these different ideas together here, we can almost see God as being something inanimate in this moment, right? It's Cain whose face changes, countenance changes, his emotion changes, everything changes, right? Based on this. But God is unchanging. And in this moment, he's unchanging. He's simply saying, no, I didn't reject this. You didn't do rightly, and so now your face has fallen. And you are the one who is disappointed in this moment because you didn't do rightly, and that's on you. It's like God is in a way here describing himself as an impartial judge in a way, right? And those who will do rightly, their sacrifice will be accepted. Those who don't, it'll be rejected. But the consequence of that rejection, it's not going to be felt by God. Because God doesn't need, as with other ancient gods, the idea was, well, you were sacrificing the food to them so they could consume it. Well, God doesn't need our food to eat. God is saying that, I'm just here. I'm impartial in this. Do rightly, it'll be accepted. Don't, and you're the one who's going to be disappointed, right? So even though the sacrifices are to him, right? This verse almost goes, we can look at these verses as a way of God saying he's not favoring Abel, right? It's not because he likes Abel better as a person. It's merely he's assessing the quality of the sacrifice, right? And so we can see almost in that response the idea of, well, if God had given Cain a chance to respond, he might have just said something like, and as a parent of kids, I've heard this before, well, you just like the other one more. And so God is sort of not even giving Cain a chance to say that and saying, nope, don't like him or you more. I'm merely assessing the quality of the sacrifice. That's all I'm doing, right? Had Cain offered the correct sacrifice, he would have had a cheerful face held high. And so the power to control his countenance rests entirely in Cain's hands, right? That is really interesting. And there's something to that, right? Because it's true, right? It's a profound lesson that is tough to learn, but it's about the nature of our feelings, right? And that we need to recognize we have more control over them than we think we do, you know? And that's in a way what God is saying here is, hey, look, whether you're depressed about this or not, or disappointed about this or not, you can change that. You're the one who can do rightly and thus have your head held high, right? And that is really interesting, right? But if you think about it, I mean, if we give of ourselves rightly to God, then we'll find ourselves singing for joy in prison chains like Paul, right? I mean, that really is the case. Sacrifice rightly to God and your face will be held high. Your countenance won't be down like Cain's. And yeah, that's something to consider, I guess. You know, I mean, in other words, what God's saying is it's not your circumstances that dictate your feelings. It's the way you approach life. And so if you approach life properly, sacrificing to God, your feelings and your joy will follow that. So something really deep to ponder, I think, in that, and think about in terms of our own lives. And it's something to challenge ourselves with, right? And to recognize too, when we are feeling down and we're feeling frustrated, that perhaps it's because we haven't given of the best of our best to God, you know? And if we had given our best of our best to God, maybe we'd be okay with even the worst circumstances, right? Even the chains of prison, in the case of Paul. So just something to think about. Not to say that we wouldn't not want to be in prison. It's just that we would we'd have a more level approach to it, you know, just a more joyful understanding of it. So, all right, next thing to consider here is what God says about the nature of sin, because this is it's a weird turn of phrase, and all of this. It looks normal, I guess, to us at first, but there's some weirdness to it to me. First of all, it should be mentioned, this is the first time we actually see the term sin, right? So although we recognize sin in the story of Adam and Eve, and we understand that it's the story of either the first or original or universal sin as we focused on it, it's not yet named there, right? And here is where we see it first named. And so if we look at the structure of what's being said, it's very interesting. It's clear that Cain is not about to sin when he kills his brother, but he had already sinned, right? If you don't do rightly, and Cain hasn't, otherwise his face would not have fallen, then you have invited sin in. So it's like because he hadn't done rightly, the sin already existed in him, and then he took it out on his brother, if you will. So the term here, that's often translated as crouches, according to several commentators, may actually be better described as couches or lies, right? In other words, it's not that sin is crouched and waiting to pounce and ensnare Cain. It's no, sin has taken up living with him, right? Because he doesn't sacrifice rightly to God. And so because he doesn't sacrifice rightly to God, sin lies with him, right? It lies at his domicile, right? And it's taken up and it lounges at the door, right? And so we I think we often tend to look at this first and think sin is waiting just outside his door, you know? And I think it might be actually that this sin is inside his door. That's what's being described here, right? Sin has already taken up living with him. And so by not sacrificing rightly, Cain has brought sin into his life, and it's his roommate, right? And so the door then becomes symbolically, right, tremendously important here, right? Our door in this way of thinking about things, symbolically, when we think about the door, our door is where we leave leave our place and head out into the world. And so symbolically, we might even think of it as we have stuff going on in our head and then our actions out in the world. And the door represents that transition between the two, right? What is within us, spiritually, mentally, all of that. And then what is it we do in the world? What is it when we go out that door and do things in the world? Treat people, handle difficulties, all of that. And so, sin now, because we're all like Cain, and for the sake of Cain here, sin couches in your home, right? It's something it's in the world, it's in all of us. It's something that lies with us. And so, if sin, the idea here being that sin, especially by the door, I mean, that means it's waiting to go out with us, right? If sin is there, lying at the door, waiting to come out with us and affect the world, right? So the idea here is that if sin inhabits our mind, it will infect our actions. Our actions are going to be corrupted by this. So this is why I say, in a way, that the sinfulness of Cain precedes everything that comes here. It precedes the sacrifice. It precedes the killing of his brother. It precedes all of that. And what God is saying is, hey, Cain, you're not sacrificing rightly. And you're not doing that because sin exists. It lies by your door. It's in you. It's ready to have an effect on you. And it leads him to not give all of himself, and then eventually leads him to take poor actions, getting worse and worse. But again, I mean, we are all Cain, right? We've all already invited sin into our lives. We all fail to make the right sacrifices. We all sin, right? So God's instruction to Cain here is not merely a warning for Cain not to kill his brother, right, as God would have known he's going to do. So it's not just a warning about that, and it's not just to Cain. I think God is instructing all of us here how to handle sin, right? And realize we all have sin by our door. Sin is waiting to go out with us into the world. It's waiting to have its effect. It's infection, if you will, upon the way we treat the world around us, right? So the command here is, it's curiously, it's a duplication, right, of what God had said would happen with the man and the woman. The woman would desire the man, and the man would rule over here. Here, sin desires Cain, and Cain must rule over it. That's because sin desires to go out the door with Cain. It desires to go out into the world with him. And Cain, though, must rule over it. It must keep it inside, close the door on it. Because you have to go out the door, right? This is part of why having it inside almost makes a little more sense, and why the commentators who have argued that phrasing, the idea that it's talking about it lying inside, the couching, right? It already being inside the door. Makes some sense because we have to go out the door in the world. And so it's not about hiding from it because it's at your door. It's about knowing it's there and wants to come out with you and ruling over it and saying, no, you can't, right? We talked about the idea, right, that the masculine must lead and then the feminine, and what that means in terms of the ruling over it. Don't let the feminine lead, the masculine must lead. Here, Cain must lead, lest the sin do so, right? And in case you're listening for the first time, when I say the masculine and the feminine, I'm not talking about men and women per se. I'm talking about the instinct. We all have a feminine side and a masculine side. So the idea being that which is masculine within us should lead rather than the feminine. And so here it's reflected again, right? Cain must lead or else sin will. And so why this odd similarity, right? We saw in the previous story, the feminine, open the door, and let the sin out, if you will, but the masculine falls prey only after the feminine does. So the masculine leads to avoid letting the sin out the door, if you will, right? And so Cain must lead here likewise to make sure that door stays shut and keeps the sin from coming out. And so, in other words, in both stories, the idea of ruling over something is in service of protecting against sin and protecting against the corrupting effects of sin. And so God giving us, in both these stories, he's given us strategies, I guess, about how we must guard against sin, right? And the first is to make sure our feminine instinct is held in the right place, right? It has a tremendously vital role, but it just needs to be kept within the boundaries of where it needs to be, almost like a garden. We talked about that when we talked about the garden and the idea of boundaries being important. So that's one way, right? Is to guard the feminine because the feminine is susceptible to temptation, right? That's sort of step one, I guess, in it. So the feminine then must be subservient to the masculine within us, because if the masculine is rightly oriented and aimed at proper fulfillment, right, of being the image of God, then it can both protect the feminine as well as ensure that the feminine within us produces the perspectives and understandings that we need to bruise the head of serpents, if you will, right? That is why that order is necessary. Bruising the head of serpent obviously being rejecting sin. That's what that would be. Inevitably, though, we all at some point fail, right? And once we fail, then we must all do what Cain fails to do here, right? Inhabited by sin, having it lie at our door like a dog wanting to come outside with us on a walk, we must keep sin in its place, right? It must not affect our actions, affect us going out the door, right? It may be within us because we are human and it's within us all, but we must prevent it from coming with us. We must rule over it by preventing its influence upon us, right? Something we obviously will fail at, just as Cain did, and thus further shows the need of Christ. That's what many of these stories do. But this is God describing the sort of the difficulty in, right, the task that lays ahead of man, because man is not only, part Adam, part Eve, but man is also, we're going to be part Abel and part Cain too. That's what we are, right? We're part spiritual, part breathy. And so just as the masculine must reject the fruit the feminine offers us, and instead the feminine, might birth the serpent fighters, we also must, reject the sin that waits at the door for us, that lies waiting to go with us. So we should, I guess, for a moment, if that's not too much to chew on, we should for a moment consider the idea here that there's kind of a hint of something exponential to this, right? There's an idea that this story captures the increasingly negative effects of sin, right? The more we do wrong, the more sin lies at our door, the harder it is for us to rule over it, and then we do more wrong, and then it lies at our door, and it has a continuing cyclical potentially getting worse and worse nature, right? In this story, that's represented very quickly, that exponential nature, with the idea of incorrect sacrifice leading all the way to killing another human being, right? Taking a life, the worst of the sins. And so, that gives us we've cut out some of the middle chunks, if you will. But I think that's what these verses serve to do by talking about the nature of sin lying by our door, is to describe to us, it can go from that to that if you let sin go unchecked, if you don't follow the instruction God gives here to Cain. And so, but, and this is important, however, we have then implied the possibility of being more like Abel, right? We have the possibility of, now Cain didn't do this, but God offered to Cain the opportunity to do rightly, and to do rightly and have his countenance lifted. And that, by the way, would keep sin from our door. And the more we do that, the less sin would be by our door. And so we'd move more in an Abel-like direction. So, but in Cain, we see the opposite example. And we're going to take a look at what happens if we fail to rule over this sin at our door. And that's what we'll take a look at in the next episode. So, yeah. All right. Sorry. Mind's spinning. A lot to chew on and think about with that stuff, at least for myself. I don't know about the rest of you, but I just need to think about where and when sin is lying at the door in my life. So, all right. Be sure to like, subscribe, review, comment, send me an email on schooltheology@protonmail.com, and we'll take a look at the consequences of Cain not ruling over sin next time. Thanks.